Most people think MMA came about fairly recently, a modern sport which only showed up a few decades ago. But the truth is, it's built on martial arts traditions that go back centuries, from every corner of the world. Wrestling, boxing, striking, grappling, and each discipline carries its own long history. We tend to throw around the term mixed martial arts a lot, but what exactly is a martial art? The word martial comes from the Latin word martialis, meaning of or belonging to Mars, the Roman god of war. And that's why most martial arts weren't originally created as sports. Most of them began as systems of combat, practical techniques for survival and warfare. Only later were they adapted, made safer, and reshaped into the sports that we recognize today. MMA is a broad term, and in theory, a fighter can bring any martial art to a mixed martial arts fight. But in practice, over time, a few styles have proven to be the most effective: wrestling, boxing, Muay Thai, and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. But if we had to trace MMA back to a single origin, there's one martial art from the ancient world that's often left out of the conversation. It was called pancration, and it was developed more than 2,500 years ago by the ancient Greeks. And what makes pancration the true ancestor of modern MMA is that it was the first recorded sport to combine both striking and grappling into one unified system. Unlike boxing or wrestling, which they also had in the ancient world, pancration was a unique innovation because it blended these two arts. And that's why when we look at ancient depictions of pancration, many of the moves we see are instantly recognizable today and look like they belong in the octagon. And to understand why the ancient Greeks created a martial art like this, we have to understand the world that they lived in. The ancient Greeks were shaped by their land. Greece was a rugged landscape of mountains and scattered islands. And that geography naturally divided the people into hundreds of small city-states or polises. Each polis developed its own culture, customs, and values, and each one was fiercely proud and independent. Because of this, rivalry was built into Greek life. City-states competed constantly against each other, sometimes in war, but also in trade, politics, and philosophy. The Greeks measured themselves against their neighbors in every way they could. And out of this constant rivalry grew an obsession for contest. Competition became a defining feature of Greek culture, and athletic sport was one of the purest ways to express it. That is why sporting competitions, from local games to the much grander Pan-Hellenic festivals, became so central to the ancient Greek identity. The Greeks expressed this love of competition in all kinds of ways. They had foot races, wrestling bouts, boxing matches, even the discus and javelin events. But among these contests, there was one that stood above the rest: pancration. And by modern standards, it would have seemed extremely brutal. Pancration was a martial art that combined boxing and wrestling into one system. Fighters were allowed to punch, kick, throw, choke, and even use joint locks on their opponents. Almost anything was allowed. The only things that were banned were biting and eye gouging. And in some places like Sparta, even those rules didn't apply. The word pancration comes from the Greek word pan, meaning all, and kratos, meaning power or force. So it literally translates to all powers, using all of your powers, all of your might. In Greek mythology, pancration was said to have been created by heroes like Hercules or Theseus. And like many Greek myths, the line between history and mythology is blurred. So we don't know exactly when pancration was first created. What we do know is that by 648 BC, it was introduced into the Olympic Games, and once it arrived, it was regarded as the ultimate combat event. Most Olympic sports had already existed for centuries before they were introduced as an event at the Olympic Games, and the same was probably true for pancration. Boxing and wrestling were already deeply rooted in ancient Greek culture, and pancration simply took what was known and adapted it further to something that was more practical for real survival situations. And ancient Greek warfare explains much about why pancration developed in the way that it did. Ancient Greek soldiers fought in something called a phalanx. It was like a wall of shields and spears pressing against each other. But in the crush of battle, weapons would break, shields would splinter, and it was common for men to lose their balance and be knocked to the ground. To survive the chaos of battle, you needed more than just strength, you needed balance. And that came from wrestling skill and the ability to fight barehanded in close quarters if need be. Pancration was there to prepare men for these realities, to strike, to grapple, and to finish a fight without weapons. On the ancient Greek battlefields, that could mean the difference between life and death. Over time, pancration became central to the ancient Greek hoplite's training, sharpening his ability to remain dangerous in any situation. This is part of what made the Spartans so feared in the ancient world. Herodotus even describes how at the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC, the Spartans fought for so long that eventually their weapons broke, and they continued to fight using only their bare hands and teeth. One can only imagine that the Spartans were relying on their pancration skills until their last moments. Some pancration champions were so well-rounded that they could win both the boxing and wrestling events in the same games. That was rare, but the fact that it happened shows how versatile these fighters were. The evidence suggests grappling was the deciding factor more often than striking. Most contests ended on the ground, and those who mastered holds and submissions usually walked away as the victors. Contests would take place in an open ground arena where other sports would also take place. Athletes competed naked, as was customary in ancient Greek athletics, and a referee enforced the rules with a rod in hand. Matches would only end if a man surrendered, was knocked out, or even killed. A defeat was signaled by raising your hand or tapping out. The same gesture that we still see in MMA today, more than 2,000 years later. Fatalities were not uncommon, especially by strangulation, as many fighters refused to tap after being caught in a chokehold. It's hard to understand the minds of ancient people. For the ancient Greeks, choosing death over surrender could be seen as a kind of victory and honor. Submissions were very prominent, and there's ample evidence to suggest that the ancient Greeks knew all or almost all the submissions that current fighters use today. They were also allowed to break their opponent's fingers and force them to submit. And there were a few pancration champions that specialized in that. And it was considered a legitimate form of winning. Winners of the pancration tournaments were regarded as heroes by their city-states and often received lavish rewards when they came back home. Their names would be inscribed on the Olympic victor lists, and they were given various prizes depending on the specific tournament that they won, with the Olympic winners receiving the famous olive wreath. Alexander the Great was known to recruit pancration fighters into his army. It has even been argued by scholars and historians that his conquests spread the techniques of pancration into Asia, and this contributed to the rise of Eastern martial arts. After the Romans conquered Greece, they would adapt a similar form of pancration and continue the practice for themselves. In the year 393 AD, the Roman Emperor Theodosius I issued an edict that outlawed all pagan festivals, including pancration. There is evidence that pancration continued in some form or another until the 6th century, though it was in more of an underground setting. Traces of pancration could be found in some parts of Greece and Anatolia until its revival this past century. Ancient Greek pancration was the first historical instance of a hybrid hand-to-hand fighting system. Modern MMA is an evolved form of the pancration that the Greeks of antiquity practiced. That's why Pancrase, one of the earliest MMA organizations where Bas Rutten was a champion, took its name directly from pancration. So the next time you watch an MMA fight, just remember, you're not simply watching a modern sport. You're witnessing the revival of an ancient tradition, one born in the sands of Olympia, where men once tested themselves in the world's first true mixed martial art, pancration. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that video, don't forget to hit subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment, and I'll see you guys in the next one.